Hi guys, and welcome back to Pass and Move. And for today's episode in our Premier League series, the tactical and team guides, of course, we're going to be covering Leicester, the ninth team in the table, according, alphabetically, of course. So we've covered everyone up until Leicester. So if your team hasn't been covered yet, then of course we'll get around to it soon enough. Everyone from Leicester onwards is still yet to be covered, and we'll be covering it. So these are one of your teams. Then obviously keep an eye out, and we'll be doing it by the day, so you can expect Liverpool tomorrow and Manchester City after tomorrow and so on and so forth. But anyways, Leicester today, obviously a very interesting team to take over. Everyone be willing to try and make the dream or the miracle really happen once again. But in terms of the board, they don't expect too much, so that's good to see. The board themselves, the only thing they want from you in terms of the Premier League is actually just finish mid-table. I reckon with the squad you've got, there is some bits of dead wood, but you should be able to get Europa League football. And if you're very lucky and perform really well, you might even squeeze into Champions League spots. But let's aim first for Europa League football. In terms of the club itself this season, I don't believe they're in anything. Yeah, there's no continental competition, so getting yourself back into Europe would be a good thing. Mid-table's kind of a bit of a low target. But apparently the season preview, they expected to finish in 10th as well. So we had to bear all this in mind, of course, when we're creating a tactic. It's important to know where you stand in the league, and that way you can adjust your tactics and, maybe go more attacking or less, or more defensive even for that matter, if you're bottom of the table, for example, like we mentioned with some of the other teams, Huddersfield, Brighton, Burnley. We've already created tactics for these teams, and they were all more on the defensive side because it sort of just made more sense. So one of the first things I like to do is actually have a quick look at my staff. Obviously I sort them out properly, but this is not what today's episode is about. I just try and find who's got the best judgment of ability so I can trust their opinion. And it looks like John Rudkin, our head of youth development and director of football, seems to know best, so we'll be trusting his judgment. If you're wondering what today's episode is all about, it really is just a tactics and team guide. We're going to be hopefully setting you up for success in the future, giving you the best tactics to work with for Leicester in Football Manager 2018, and at the same time we'll also be giving you advice about who to sell, who you should keep, what areas you might want to invest in, and so on and so forth. So the next thing to do is obviously have a look at the squad. One of the things I like to do as well in the beginning is actually go to the under 23s, include the under 18s, and just see if there's any overage players who aren't supposed to be down here. So Mendy is one of those players, and I think there's also Ben Hammer, if I'm not mistaken, one of those names. Either way, there's like 2 or 3 players here that weren't actually supposed to be here, so I moved them up to the first team squad where we can decide what to do with them. Another thing is obviously have a look at the ability, see if there's any other under 23s or under 18 players who are ready for first team football. So just having a look at the best. One of them is Alex here, and he's just Sky Bet League 1 ability, so definitely no spot for him in the first team, and you can assume anyone below him is not good enough just yet. So yeah, that moves me back up to the first team squad, and obviously I need to, one of the first things I like to do as well is also have a look at how many numbers we've actually got. So bearing that in mind, we've got a squad of 26 players, so that's good to see, because obviously the way I like to work at least is to have a squad of 22 first team players. I guess you could call them first team football, but what I'm talking about is a starting 11. So I like to have a starting 11 of obviously 11 players who are leading players or star players or world-class players, and that way you can almost always challenge for the Premier League title, of course. And the better your players, the more likely you are to obviously compete in the Champions League and possibly win a title or two over there too. And then I like to have a backup 11 of players, youngsters normally, because I feel like that gives a good balance. Your first 11 should be, prime players, developed players already. But obviously there's cases where there's youngsters who are already leading players for the division. But anyways, the backup 11 are youngsters who have plenty of potential to become, obviously they have to be ready for the first division, that's more important, and then they also have to have potential of becoming leading star or world-class players, and that way you have a nice little balance there. The first teamers are trying to get first team football, they're doing everything they can, and they're keeping the first 11, the starting 11, on their toes, of course, in terms of, they always know that their first team spot is not necessarily secure. So that's just the balance I like to go with. So having 26 players is good to see. That means we're 4 over, which means you could possibly sell some players and maybe look to invest that elsewhere without, destroying the numbers in your squad. But also obviously can mean that you have some extra numbers in other positions, and some positions you don't have enough numbers. But anyways, first off, we can start by having a look at what the best 11 players in the squad are. So from Adrian Silva here to about Demarai Gray, that's the 11 players there. And then that's how I kind of decide how to make my tactic, what formation I should use more specifically. So we've got a centre midfielder here, and we've got a striker, a right winger, a defensive midfielder, centre back, striker, left back, goalkeeper, centre back, defensive midfielder, and left winger. So I thought my two options are to either play a two striker formation. That obviously has wingers involved, or I can play a 4-3-3 by the looks of it, because we have some strength in midfield apparently. But I decided to go with the 4-4-2 formation just because we've got two strikers that we're trying to get the best out of, Vardy and Slimani. It also makes sense because Silva is technically out for quite some time. I'm sure everyone knows his real life issues, and they've kind of gone into Football Manager as well. So I think he wasn't able to be registered before the last day of the season. I don't know whether you could still do it, but I think the game, to make sure no one can actually bypass that rule, they've made him unavailable to play club football until January comes around. So you have to keep that in mind. He's the best player in your squad apparently, leading player for the division, and in terms of star ratings, he's really high, 4.5 stars for your current squad. So yeah, so just keeping all of that in mind, it seems like the best thing to do is go with a 4-4-2, and that's the tactic we're working with today. So keeping that in mind, we can now figure out where we need numbers. So we've got 3 goalkeepers and we only really need 2. Kasper Schmeichel's obviously a first teamer. He's a good player. You can definitely improve on that if you can bring in... Let me just say this actually from the start. Do not invest in a player... sell a player first before buying a player. Wait, what did I say? That was a bit confusing. Alright, what I'm trying to say is do not, move a player on before you actually buy a player, because obviously that might leave you short on numbers. So if you already have excess numbers like here, you can easily sell one of these and be happy because you still have your numbers. That's alright. But if you've only got 2 goalkeepers and you're looking to bring in someone better into your squad, then bring that player in first and then sell the player that you don't need off after, because you don't want to sell your player off. You only have got 1 goalkeeper, and then you realize the player that you're trying to buy has moved elsewhere, the transfer falls through, or any of that sort of business, and next thing you know you're short of goalkeepers, and then maybe you panic buy and buy someone who's not good enough, and then it's sort of just kind of pointless. So my advice is always to buy first and then sell. Only really sell if you're 100% confident that the player you're going for is going to come to your team, but obviously that's very risky, sort of a risky strategy. But anyways, keeping that in mind, Kasper Schmeichel's only good. So like we mentioned, we want our first team goalkeeper to be leading. Schmeichel is our first team goalkeeper at the moment. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind. In terms of who you're going to sell from Ben Hamer or Eldin, it looks like Ben Hamer is a championship goalkeeper. You won't need him. Definitely, he's not even good enough for the Premier League. He's worth 3.2 million and not too much wages, but you're better off just moving him on. You don't need him at all. And you've already got Eldin here, who you just bought in. He's a championship player as well, which is a bit of an issue. Hopefully his ability improves later on in the season. Maybe my staff members misjudged his ability. But yeah, championship player bought in for 2.3 million is not good enough. The sooner you can move him on, the better, but you're not going to be able to move him on this season. So my advice is just sell Ben Hamer, keep Eldin up until about January. If you can move him on in January, then sell him and bring in a top goalkeeper who's better than Kasper Schmeichel, and Schmeichel will have to be demoted down to a rotational sort of player, which is what you kind of have to target for. He's good, the fans love him, all that sort of business, but in truth, if you want to become a top team, you need a top goalkeeper, and Schmeichel apparently in this game at least he's not one of those. Right back's definitely an area to improve in. You've only got Danny Simpson, so you'll need someone better. Simpson's a decent player for the Premier League, so at least he's ready for this division. That's good enough for us. The rest of your squad are sort of more like good or leading players, so Danny Simpson's one of the weaker players in the squad, but unfortunately he is your only right back. So your best option is not to invest in a youngster like we mentioned. It actually is better for you to get a proper good right back and demote Danny Simpson to a rotational squad status. If he complains, you can obviously always move him on, but keep him on for now, because obviously you can't suddenly change the whole makeup out of your squad from players that you've got into leading players and backup youngsters with tons of potential. That's just not how the way the game works. So yeah, I think that's my advice for the right back spot. In terms of centre backs, you've got excess numbers. You've got Huth, Morgan, Johan, Drogovic, and Maguire. Now you've already improved, or the club rather, have already improved in the centre back position by bringing in Harry Maguire. He's a good player and he can improve into a leading one. So we're going to try and give him a first team football. He's going to be partnered with Morgan actually. Huth is only considered a decent player for the competition now and likely will decrease in terms of ability. You've brought in also a loanee in Dragovic, who also very closely could have been a first team footballer. In fact, his squad status is a first team one, but he's going to be a bit of a rotational option for us. I feel like Harry Maguire is someone that you actually invested in and bought in. This player is just on loan, so you don't have to worry too much about giving him game time. You can probably trigger his optional future fee, but if you ask me, you could probably do a bit better. If we can assume that Harry Maguire becomes a leading player for the Premier League, and you've got Morgan alongside him, maybe you can just bring in another leading centre-back instead. Morgan probably by the end of the season, I reckon this season, but if it is next season, then he'll be a decent player only. At least Huth is good enough, so that's 4 players that are good enough for the division, and Johan apparently as well. If you ask me who should be moved on, the likelihood is that Johan is the one to move on. Huth has some fan power, which can be taken into consideration, but the thing is he's happy with the rotation option the same way that Johan is. So really your option is maybe you could, I'm not 100% sure. You don't want to get rid of Dragovic actually, so let's leave that. Your options are to either get rid of Robert Huth or Johan Beneluin, and you'd still have 4 solid centre backs. No necessary real need to get rid of anyone. The truth is maybe you should be getting rid of both Huth and Johan and bringing in a youngster with potential who could eventually partner Harry Maguire. That would seem to make the most sense. At the moment we kind of just want to bring the whole squad up to a level of good players for the division, and then after we've done that we can bring up the whole squad to a leading players for the division. So we kind of have to have a no-nonsense policy for decent players. So really Huth and Johan should be the ones to go and bring in a youngster with potential. And then obviously do that at the moment with Morgan decreases as well. But at least you've got 5 centre-backs, you only need 4, so you can, if you're happy with your centre-backs, you could just sell one of these and still make a healthy profit. Robert Huth is possibly the more expensive one. Nope, apparently Johan is. He is youngster, to be fair. You might want to consider selling him because he's an African player. He's never gotten an international cap, but if Tunisia ever decided to call him up, you might miss him for huge chunks of the Premier League season during the African Cups, African Cup of Nations I think it's called, you'd miss him. It's unlikely, but it's just something to consider, make him a little bit weaker I suppose. His wages aren't as much as Huth. Nope, his wages are more than Huth. That's a bit shocking. Well, anyways, that's even more reason to sell him and move him on, and that's just kind of how you have to consider your squad. Left backs, you've got the numbers, but do you have the ability? Fuchs is definitely a good enough player. It's a bit tough in terms of finding good fullbacks. I always mention it because the game does lack top fullbacks. It's really a bit of a rarity in comparison to other positions. But we'll work with what we've got. So we've got good at least. Ben Chilwell unfortunately is just a championship player, so you're better off moving him on loan. Do not sell him. I think he's good enough to become a first team eventually. He's just not ready at the moment. So send him out on loan to a championship club. Bring in a player on loan who's a decent backup to Fuchs and is actually ready for for the Premier League, and that should be good enough for your left back spot for this season at least. In terms of central midfielders, so we only need 4, but we've got 6. We are playing a 4-4-2 formation, so we do have to keep that in mind. Bearing that in mind, obviously, your partnership is going to be Silva and Obora eventually, but obviously in the beginning of the season, you're going to be missing Silva for quite some time, so just keep that in mind. But we're trying to build a good tactic for the current squad, and so that's the reason why we had to use Silva. So Silva, like we mentioned, a leading player. You've got Obora as well, who's a good player for the team. Maybe the weak spots. Ndidi is a youngster with potential, so don't move him on. He's ready for the Premier League. You can say the same about Daniel Marti. No, wait a second. I didn't realize he's actually a championship player. So this is where you kind of have a decision to make. He's borderline going to be ready for Premier League action. So do you be ruthless and move him, send him out on loan and hope he comes back a Premier League player? Or do you assume that maybe John Rudkin's made a tiny bit of a mistake because he doesn't have the best judgment of ability. 14 is really good, but not the best. And maybe Daniel Marti is actually ready for first team football. So this is kind of like where you have to make a decision. And obviously you've got Andy King, who's a decent player for the Premier League, and you've got Matty James, a championship player. So James definitely needs to move on. That leaves you with 5. If we assume that this is where you have a decision to make, do you move on King and send Ndidi on loan and then bring in a player who's ready on loan for the Premier League, just for the seasons until Ndidi comes back? But at the moment, sorry, not Ndidi, Amartey rather, is the one who's a championship player. Or do you just move on King and hope Amartey actually is a Premier League player, and that way you survive? But either way, you know, King is just a decent player, so it's better to move him on. 28 years of age, you're not going to be able to get more money than you are ever. You know, this is a perfect time really to sell him off. 28 years of age, he's expecting first team football when he really isn't a first teamer. 14 million you get out of him, and you'll get rid of 40k wages, which you can definitely put into other areas of your squad. So that's kind of the central midfield sorted out, where you've got excess numbers. In terms of wingers, we need 4 of them, and 4 we do have. The problem is, it really is just Riyad Mahrez and Demarai Gray who are suited to the tactic we're using. So Mahrez is a leading player, definitely keep him of course as long as you can. Demarai Gray's a youngster with potential, but he can definitely be one of the best players in your squad. At the moment he is a first teamer because there's no one better, but you might want to consider bringing in a better player for that spot. But either way, Musa and Albrighton are your other players, and both of them are just decent players. In fact, actually, Musa's a championship player. He's got a bit more potential, but you'll only ever become a decent Premier League player, apparently. So the truth is, you're better off selling them both. 16 million from Ahmed Musa. Mark Albrighton will get you about 17.5 million. And I think Albrighton's expecting first team football. Musa's is a rotation. Alright, so Albrighton's expecting football that he's not going to get, and Musa's on high wages for a rotational player. And the truth is, neither of them. Maybe Albrighton suits the tactic, but it's still, you know, sort of, I don't know. I mean, you kind of have to make a decision. He's an English player, so maybe you do want to hold on to him, but we're trying to move away from decent players. So you'd be better off, like I said, selling these 2 and maybe bringing in a youngster as a backup to Mahrez, and then bringing in an actual first teamer to overtake Gray's position, and Demarai Gray can compete with that first teamer. We'll show you the tactics in just a second. That's just what we're working with. So at least you've got numbers there to work with, but you do want to bring in better players. Your first, in terms of the actual squad depth, you've only got Mahrez, who actually is or should be a part of your first team. It's unlikely that Gray's already a good player for the division. He's 3 stars, so it's more likely to put him down as a decent Premier League player, but with plenty of potential, of course. In terms of strikers, we need 4 of them, and we've got 5, so we've got excess. We'll be looking to who we can sell, but the truth is, Iheanacho's not going anywhere because they just brought him in. Slimani is a good player, and Vardy's a leading player for the Premier League, of course, unless they've demoted him. Oh, he's a leading player. So like usually with 3 strikers, only really one option open up. So is it going to be Okazaki or Olua? Okazaki's a decent player, and Leonardo is a championship player. So obviously Leonardo should be moved on. That's the obvious option because he's not even good enough for the Premier League. But Okazaki is kind of where you have to consider what you want to do. He's a decent player for the Premier League. If you ask me, 102 caps for Japan, damn, I didn't know he featured for his national team that much. If you ask me, you're better off selling him. I don't think you can get any more money from him than he is at the moment, 13.75 million. He's a decent player. We're trying to move away from that. So if you sell him and have a backup youngster with potential, then that means you've got Iheanacho and another youngster who are going to hopefully become your new partners once Slimani and Vardy sort of die away. They're both 29 and 30, so it's kind of the perfect age. Iheanacho's just 20 years older as well, so if you bring in someone around the same age, ready for first team football for the Premier League is in, and a youngster with plenty of potential, you've got a very, very nice balance for your striker position. But yeah, that at least is the squad sorted out. So in terms of the tactics, this is how we're shaping up. Let's expand that there. So the idea is to play with a control mentality, a structured team shape. I don't like too many instructions, so that's why we're going with structured. Structured means each player does their own little role. In terms of when you play with fluid, the whole team defends together and attacks together. But when you play with, of course, structured, it's a bit different. Everyone has their own little role to do. And I think with fluid, you know, putting plenty of team instructions kind of makes sense because you're giving instructions to the team as a whole. And you're playing with a fluid mentality, which means the team works better as a cohesive unit. and so that kind of comes hand in hand together. As obviously there's no hard and fast rules with this type of thing. It's football at the end of the day, but it's just my tactical opinion on it. And so that reason we go with structure that should keep a better team shape. Bearing in mind we're playing a 4-4-2 formation, control's not the best for it, but it should work well enough with the tactics that we're using. We can have sort of a different mix of overlapping players, for example here, and direct sort of partnerships. We have also direct partnership here, overlapping sort of stuff here. Good partnerships all around, really, and so we had to keep that in mind when we're making our tactic as well. Leicester, a bit of a tough decision to make when you're managing them. You can take them in many different directions with the squad they've got, but this is the one we've gone with to hopefully bring out the best out of them. The other option was obviously playing possession football, going with a 4-3-3, that type of thing. There was a pass and move sort of football option as well, but that means playing with a 4-2-3-1 or a 4-4-1-1, that type of thing. We didn't really have too many attacking midfielders, so there's many different ways you could have taken it, but I feel like this is the best way to bring it out of them and play the players in their most comfortable positions as well as the roles as much as possible, of course. So bearing that in mind, we've got Schmeichel here in the goalkeeper, just his regular goalkeeper role. We don't need anything more than that. Fuchs is playing as a fullback on support. We need these crosses from deep, and only fullbacks on support can do that. I'd love to have played a wing back on support to complement the inside winger, inverted winger rather, because I feel like that works a bit better. But a fullback on support with an inside inverted winger on attack should suit just as well. So we've got Damari on that. The attack duty works well with Slimani as well. And then we also got the other flank doing the opposite, basically wing back on attack from Simpson, and we've got Mahrez on as inside inverted winger on support. So these two should hopefully give us more control in midfield. We're playing as a more direct passing, so hopefully there's a lot of balls into Vardy and Slimani. But hopefully, playing a 4-4-2 normally means the midfield's quite open, but hopefully these inverted wingers can come in and give some more protection to the only two central midfielders in the tactic that we've got. You also have another option, which is actually to play Mahrez as the attacking one, Simpson as the support, and basically switch this around from one flank to the other. That is an option, but that means moving Slimani to the right as an advanced forward and Vardy as a defensive forward on the left, and that would mean that Slimani, who's a right-footed striker, will be playing on the right-hand side, which doesn't necessarily suit him for when he's trying to take shots. So that's kind of just why I'm doing that. I think Mahrez is probably the better player to be playing on attacking duty, but obviously it just doesn't make too much sense. Given the position. See, he's much better as flair and finishing and whatnot in comparison to Gray. Gray is actually best as a winger, but that means him playing on the right flank, but obviously that doesn't suit us, so we're going to be playing him as an inverted winger. He can definitely improve in some aspects. Decision making is one of the key ones that are a bit of a worry, but he's definitely also got the flair and finishing needed to be on the attacking thing. I mean, his finishing could do with some work, but he is a youngster with potential, plenty of it as well, so his decision making is naturally kind of poor at a young age. It should improve the more, the older he gets and the more game time he gets as well. So the inside inverted wingers is kind of what we're going for. We've got ball playing defender as well. We're trying to have players who play risky passes. We are playing a direct type of football, so it makes sense. So Maguire is going to be that one. He should do that role very well. He's got plenty of vision, passing, that sort of business. His first touch could do some work, and concentration is a bit of an issue. But hopefully with a tiny bit of potential he's still got left over, he should hopefully improve. But yeah, just keep an eye on that. Playing structured team shape should help in terms of his defensive issues or weaknesses. Morgan as a standard central defender, really, he's more of a stopper, which is what he prefers best, but we're playing an offside trap, so we need the whole defensive line in the same line, and so unfortunately that means we can't push him up. Got ball winning midfielder on defend duty here in Abora, naturally an anchor man. He's a little bit uncomfortable playing in central midfield. It's a natural position for him, but in terms of the role itself, ball winning midfielder, he can do excellently. But he's just a tiny bit uncomfortable with it because he's more naturally an anchor man, but still be good enough. He's natural in the position, so that should be fine. Silva, we tried to bring out the best out of him by playing a box-to-box midfielder. He will roam, he will do his business, and he should do it really well, in truth. Play short, simple passes might be a bit of an issue because we're trying to play direct football, so maybe try and get one of your coaches to stop him from playing this type of trait, of course. But otherwise, attribute-wise, he's perfect. He could do just about any role for you. in terms of midfield, and as you can see, he's quite comfortable playing any sort of role. If you ask me, I'd love him as a roaming playmaker. I feel like a roaming playmaker is a box-to-box midfielder plus vision, really, and finish, dribbling and that sort of business. But just, bearing in mind that he's not too comfortable with it, and some of his physicals aren't too great for it, I suppose. We've just left him as a natural box-to-box midfielder where he's most comfortable, and hopefully that should bring out the best out of one of the best players, or actually is technically the best player in our squad. So keeping that in mind, we've got Vardy here as a defensive forward on support. To be honest with you, I feel like he's best as an advanced forward, or even more so as a poacher, but apparently he's not that comfortable with it. It's just about half of that circle there. So he can definitely still play as a defensive forward. Positioning needs work, but I don't think I've ever come across a striker who's a defensive forward with amazing positioning. It's just kind of a natural thing that lacks for them. But he loves it best, and it does kind of suit our tactic as well, so it kind of just made sense to play him as is. And in that sense, we've also got Slimani playing as an advanced forward. He's definitely better as a target man, but he's got some decent acceleration and pace to be able to play as an advanced forward. Passing's decent, work rate is there, off the ball, anticipation, finishing, all that sort of business is good enough. Dribbling needs a tiny bit of work, but he should just about do the job for us there. You might want to get rid of plays with back to goal, because he's playing as advanced forward. It works really well for a target man role, but we need him as an advanced forward, so try and get that player trait to go away. That's kind of it. Hope trying to bring out the best out of our squad, as well as playing them in their most comfortable roles. This is the average role suitability, so we've done quite well. You're never actually going to fulfill this this circle here, to be honest, but about 3/4 of the way looks just about as good enough as we're ever going to get it. So yeah, we're trying to play with a tactic that suits us. So 4-4-2, trying to play with a control mentality, because we do want to attack, but at the same time we want to be wary of the opposition team counter-attacking us. And at the same time we want to play direct football, because we are playing a 4-4-2, which that suits. We're not necessarily playing a formation that suits keeping possession, and obviously also to bring out the best out of our players. So putting that all together, it just sort of made sense to play with this type of tactic and with these type of roles. So I feel like that's the best way to go ahead of it. And in terms of, I think that we've covered tactics and team guide, but we can cover some tiny little things. Obviously our staff would need some improvement. The training, I always keep it on balanced during pre-season. I have it on intensity level as high, and then obviously during the season it's just balanced and average. Main focus for match preparation depends on what the scout tells me of the opposition. Schedule, you can definitely improve with better friendlies. You don't necessarily need some of these teams that you're playing against, are quite useless. Competition expectations, FA Cup is a 5th round. You enter the 3rd round, you should be able to get there. The same with the League Cup. Now bear in mind, do not take these competitions lightly, especially the League Cup, because if you win it you get Europa League football, and the same goes with FA Cup, but you're more likely to win the League Cup. So do take this competition very seriously, and even if you underperform in the Premier League, or even if you actually meet mid-table expectations, you might still get Europa League football through the Carabao Cup. And that's one way to go through it. Scouting system's been revamped to give as much budget as possible. It really does help. You want to try and change Leicester into a top Premier League team, so you do want to set them on the world packages for both the senior and youth ones. Transfers, you've got some clauses still, but no ins or outs, so that's, I guess, good to see. Club, we can actually have a quick look at the club history. So just a single Premier League title, you're going to want to do something different here. Not only are you going to want to win the Premier League, obviously that's the target you want to set for yourself, but at the same time you do want to add a dominance to the league. Leicester City won the Premier League and that was kind of over for them, but you want to add an actual dominance. You want to try and set yourself the target of winning the Premier League 3 times in a row, and that makes you a serious Premier League contender, and it's unlikely that your club will ever drop off after that. I don't think anyone's ever won 3 Premier League titles in a row, so just dropped away from that. Obviously, unless 100 years down the line or whatever, that's kind of normal or expected, I suppose. In terms of the board though, we already talked about them generally. You've got some stuff that you should probably get in, but if you ask me in terms of the budget, you've got a really good budget for a mid-table team supposedly, but obviously I like to have it more in the middle, leaning towards transfer budget, so you can actually expect yourself to have more about 14 million. If you leave it on 24 million, you've got about 90k wages or 80k wages to give out to whoever you're giving it, and then obviously you're still stretching the board's finances very thin, and that's why I like to have it in the middle, leaning towards transfer budget budget. I feel like that's a bit more of a realistic number. In terms of finances, 41 million in the bank, and that's why you don't want to spend the whole 24. But obviously Premier League money will always have your bank safe. Just try and survive this season, of course. Future transfer budgets will always keep improving because of the Premier League money that's coming in. But you will, of course, want to keep an eye out on your balance and you know, how much money you're spending on wages and whatnot. Maybe youngsters to look out for is the next thing to do. You don't have anyone necessarily ready, like we mentioned. Mendy, when he comes back from his loan, might be good enough for your first team. No, he's just a championship player. Maybe you could move him on. But in terms of actual potential, you only really do have Kapustka here, who's an inside forward, but he can be an inverted winger, so he'll slot into your team perfectly. And let's really hope he comes back ready for first team action. He's actually a Polish international, and so he would be perfect, because you just keep that in mind about the Demarai Gray position that we were talking about. Because if you do buy a first teamer and then you've got Demarai Gray and that first teamer, and then you've got Kapustka coming back, that might be a bit of a concern. So maybe it's just something to keep in mind while you're making your decisions. Attribute wise though, he is amazing for the inverted winger role. And that's kind of it. Everyone else here, not so much. They do have some decent potential, but you never know, maybe one of these will actually exceed their potential, so just keep an eye out on them. Give them as much club football as possible, sending them out on loan and all that sort of business. But otherwise, I think that we've covered just about everything. So if you did enjoy today's episode, of course, please do hit the like button and subscribe for more Daily Football Manager 2018 content. And thank you guys once more for watching.